I never thought that working as a camp counselor would be anything other than the ideal summer job. I'd been to camp as a kid, had some fun, learned a few things, and made memories that I still remembered fondly. So, when I saw the listing for a camp counselor position at a remote camp nestled deep in the woods, I thought it would be a great opportunity. The job promised decent pay, beautiful surroundings, and, of course, the chance to work with kids. What could possibly go wrong? The first time I laid eyes on Camp Blackwood, I could already sense something was off. The camp was located miles away from civilization, and as our van wound its way up the dirt path, the towering trees and thick foliage made it seem as though we were entering another world altogether. The camp itself seemed stuck in time. Rusted swings, a creaky main lodge, and wooden cabins that had seen better days. From the outside, it looked like a forgotten relic, untouched for decades. But the charm of it was undeniable. At least, it seemed that way at first. The camp manager, Mr. Harding, was a tall man in his mid-40s with a sharp jawline and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He welcomed us with a handshake that felt oddly cold, but he quickly turned his attention to the tasks at hand, giving us the rundown of the camp's rules. There was no mention of strange occurrences or the unsettling air that seemed to hang around the place. It was just another summer camp in the woods. After the introductions, we were led to our respective cabins. My cabin housed 4 campers, kids aged 11 to 13, full of energy and excitement for the summer. They were eager to dive into the usual camp activities: swimming, hiking, archery. They talked a lot, laughed often, and seemed genuinely excited to be there. But beneath their excitement, I noticed something strange. There was a wariness in their eyes. It wasn't the typical excitement you'd expect from kids who were free from their parents for the summer. These kids seemed guarded, like they were aware of something I wasn't. At first, I dismissed it as just camp jitters. But as the day went on, the feeling didn't go away. It was quiet here, unnaturally quiet. The air felt thick, almost stagnant, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. The sun dipped behind the trees earlier than I expected, casting long shadows over the campgrounds. The quiet wasn't the peaceful kind you get when you're surrounded by nature. It was oppressive, as if the silence was waiting for something. After a long day of settling in and preparing for activities, I gathered the campers by the campfire for the usual evening bonding ritual. As we sat there, roasting marshmallows and talking, one of the kids, Ben, spoke up in a low voice. "Has anyone told you about the disappearances?" he asked, glancing nervously at the other kids. The others fell silent, their faces becoming serious. I chuckled, thinking it was just some campfire story, but I noticed that Ben's eyes were wide with fear. "The disappearances?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," Ben said, his voice barely above a whisper. "People go missing here sometimes. Just vanish. No one knows where they go. It's like they're swallowed up by the woods." The other campers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. I tried to laugh it off, thinking they were just trying to spook me. "Oh, come on, Ben. You mean stories, right? Campfire tales?" "No." Ben shook his head, his voice unwavering. "I'm serious. My older brother was here a few years ago. He disappeared, and nobody really talks about it. But the people who were here before him, they told him to be careful. They said it's the forest. It takes people sometimes." The group was silent now, all of them staring into the fire, and for a brief moment I felt something shift in the air. The campfire flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across their faces. I tried to reassure the kids, telling them it was probably just local legend or something made up to add mystery to the camp. But deep down, a small seed of doubt was planted. It wasn't just the story, it was the fear in their eyes. These kids weren't just telling stories. They had experienced something they couldn't explain, something that had affected them deeply. That night, I lay awake in my bed, listening to the sounds of the forest. The wind rustled through the trees, the occasional hoot of an owl echoing in the distance. But beneath those familiar sounds, there was something else, something faint, like a distant whisper. It seemed to be coming from the woods just beyond the campgrounds. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but the unease in the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. The next morning, I shook off the unease as best I could. I had a job to do, and I was determined not to let the kids' stories get to me. But as the day unfolded, I couldn't ignore the strange things happening around me. The campers were on edge, frequently glancing over their shoulders, and some of them had an odd reluctance to venture into certain parts of the camp, especially near the forest edge. And then, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The camp manager, Mr. Hardin, would often disappear for hours at a time, never telling anyone where he went. The kids said he had been around the camp for years, but no one really knew much about him. By the end of the first day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The camp wasn't just a peaceful summer retreat, it was hiding something dark. The silence in the air, the strange warnings from the kids, and Mr. Harding's odd behavior all pointed to the same conclusion. This camp was more than it seemed, and whatever secret it held, I was about to become part of it. The first few days at Camp Blackwood passed with a creeping sense of unease. While the camp itself was undeniably beautiful, the towering trees, the stillness of the nearby lake, and the idyllic setting, it was also unnervingly silent at times. The kids were still on edge, whispering to each other in corners when they thought I wasn't listening. They would glance nervously at the woods and the seemingly endless expanse of trees, as if they were waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. But I did my best to keep them engaged. We had swimming lessons, campfire sing-alongs, and hiking trips. On the surface, everything seemed normal, even cheerful. The campers, despite their initial hesitation, began to warm up to me. I had a handful of kids in my group, each of them with their own quirks, but none of them seemed as concerned as Ben had been on that first night. Ben, though, still had that shadow over him, always looking over his shoulder, always making sure he wasn't alone. I thought it was just homesickness, but something told me there was more to it. It wasn't until the fourth day that things started to take a disturbing turn. We were out on a hike, taking the usual trail that led to a clearing with a beautiful view of the lake. It was late afternoon, and the sun had begun to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows on the path. The kids were excited, laughing and running ahead, but I noticed Ben had lagged behind, his eyes darting nervously toward the woods. "Ben, you all right?" I called out, walking back toward him. He gave me a forced smile, but his eyes were filled with a kind of fear that I couldn't shake. "Yeah, just tired," he muttered, but I could tell something was bothering him. I didn't push him further, but I made a mental note to check in later. The kids seemed distracted, having fun, but I felt that same weight in the air that I couldn't explain. Something was off. I kept seeing fleeting shadows in the trees, shapes that moved just outside my peripheral vision, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. The trees seemed to be closing in, the woods more alive than usual. As we approached the clearing, I decided to call for a short break. The kids plopped down on the grass, pulling out water bottles and snacks. I took the opportunity to check in with Ben. He had taken a seat a little farther from the others, picking at the grass with his fingers. "Hey, everything okay?" I asked, sitting beside him. "You're acting weird. You've been like this all week." Ben looked at me, and for the first time I saw something that chilled me to the bone. There was a genuine fear in his eyes, the kind that you don't see in a child unless they've seen something they can't explain. I don't know if I can stay here anymore," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "The others, they don't see it, but I do. I hear things in the woods. Sometimes at night, when I go to bed, I hear someone calling my name." My heart skipped a beat. "Ben, it's just the woods. You're hearing things, okay? There's nothing here, just nature." "No," Ben insisted, his voice trembling. "It's not just that. It's like something is waiting. It's been waiting for years. It's in the trees, watching us. And sometimes I see things, like shadows moving in the corner of my eyes or things just out of sight, but they're real." I felt a shiver run down my spine. I had thought it was all just kids' stories, but there was a tension in the air now, something palpable that I couldn't ignore. "Ben, you're just spooked, okay? We're out here and we're safe. Just enjoy the camp." But Ben wasn't looking at me anymore. His eyes were locked on the tree line, and his face had gone pale. I followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual, just the thick forest, the dense woods stretching into the distance. I gently took his arm. "Come on, it's just the forest. Nothing's going to hurt you here." But Ben wouldn't budge. "It's not just the forest, though. It's the camp," he whispered urgently, looking back at me. "I'm telling you, people, they disappear here. They leave, and nobody knows why." Before I could respond, the distant sound of a branch snapping echoed from the woods, sharp and loud in the quiet afternoon. I froze. Ben wasn't the only one who had heard it. The other campers had stopped talking, their faces turning toward the woods. The whispering wind had died down, and all that was left was an eerie, suffocating silence. I stood up slowly, scanning the trees, but all I could see were the same old trunks and branches swaying slightly in the breeze. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there watching us. My eyes darted back to the kids and then to the trees again. "We're heading back," I said firmly, trying to mask the uncertainty in my voice. "Grab your things, now." As we made our way back to camp, the unease in my chest only grew. The camp had always felt quiet, but now it felt empty, as though the trees, the ground beneath my feet, were holding their breath. The campers were quieter now, and I could see the unease on their faces. They all knew something I didn't. By the time we returned to camp, the sun had almost set, casting long shadows across the grounds. The campfire wasn't lit yet, and there was no one in sight. The eerie silence seemed to have settled in. The kids scattered to their cabins, but I noticed Ben was nowhere to be found. Panic set in as I rushed to his cabin, knocking on the door, but there was no answer. My heart raced as I turned to look at the other counselors, but they were acting strangely calm, almost too calm for what had just happened. And then it hit me. Ben was gone. The realization that Ben was missing struck me like a heavy weight to the chest. At first, I told myself it was a mistake, that maybe he had gone back to his cabin or was somewhere else on the campgrounds. But as I knocked on doors and searched through the camp, my heart sank. The kids, the counselors, everyone. No one had seen him. The evening was quickly descending into unease, and the once lively camp was now filled with an unnerving stillness. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The forest beyond the camp seemed to loom closer, as if it was reaching out to consume everything in its path. The trees were darker, their branches more twisted, and every rustle of leaves sent a chill down my spine. Something about this place, this camp, was suffocating, and it wasn't just the woods. It was the history, the whispers, the disappearances that no one wanted to talk about. I gathered the other counselors together, and we started searching the woods. We had flashlights in hand, and the sun was nearly gone, leaving behind only the faintest light to guide us. The dark seemed to swallow everything around us, the trees casting long, twisted shadows that looked like clawing hands. The air was thick and stagnant, as though it hadn't moved in years. No wind rustled the leaves, no night animals chirped or howled. It was eerily silent, unnaturally silent. The first hour of searching felt endless. We split up in teams, calling out for Ben, hoping that maybe he had wandered off and was just hiding somewhere, too scared to respond. But every call was met with silence. We came to a clearing near the lake where the trees seemed to part, offering an unsettling view of the still water. Something about the way the water reflected the moonlight made my skin crawl. It was as if the lake itself was watching, waiting. I hesitated at the edge, but the others pressed on, their faces grim. We circled back to the camp around midnight, but still no sign of Ben. It had been hours, and in those hours, the kids had grown more nervous, their quiet glances at each other speaking volumes. The campers, who had once been full of life, now seemed to shrink in on themselves, avoiding the edges of the woods, casting fearful glances at the trees as though something was moving behind them, watching. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the same sounds, footsteps just out of reach, the creaking of branches, the whispering wind that wasn't really wind. I tried to brush it off, but the more I heard it, the more it seemed like someone was walking just outside the cabin, watching me through the walls. I told myself it was just nerves. It was just the forest. But deep inside, I knew that something dark had been awakened, something that hadn't wanted to be found. The next day, we called the local authorities. They arrived at the camp early, bringing with them the usual mix of questions and investigations. We retraced our steps, checked the areas we had already searched, but still no sign of Ben. They brought in search dogs, but even they couldn't track him. The dogs seemed disoriented, sniffing the ground and then pulling back, growling low in their throats as though something was stopping them from finding the scent. By the time evening fell, the whole camp was on edge. I felt like the walls were closing in. The kids were quieter now, huddling together in their cabins, eyes wide with fear. I walked the campgrounds, looking for any clues, any hint of where Ben could be. But all I could see were the towering trees, standing silent and still like silent sentinels, watching from the darkness. Around midnight, I decided to check the old library, a room that hadn't been used in years, hidden behind the main lodge. The library was where I'd found the old journal the night Ben had mentioned the disappearances. Maybe, just maybe, there was something else in the journal I had missed. A pattern, a clue, something that could explain all of this. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew I had to explore every possibility. The library was dusty, the air thick with the smell of old paper and mildew. As I scanned the shelves, something caught my eye. An old map of the campgrounds, yellowed with age. It was a map I had never seen before, one that wasn't in the camp's regular files. As I studied it, a chill ran down my spine. The map was marked with symbols, strange, jagged lines that seemed to form circles, with one location circled repeatedly, over and over again. The spot marked on the map was deep in the woods, far from the camp's usual boundaries. It was an area where no one had ever ventured, and I wondered why it was marked in such a way. The deeper I looked, the more my heart sank. The symbols weren't just marks on a map. They were warnings. Warnings about the edge of the camp, where people disappeared, where Ben had vanished. I turned quickly, a sense of urgency rising in me. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like the forest itself was calling to me, urging me to go deeper, to uncover the truth that no one had ever dared to acknowledge. I had to find Ben, and I had to find him fast. As I made my way toward the woods once again, I felt a cold hand wrap around my heart. The trees loomed closer, casting their long shadows, and I could feel the weight of something ancient and powerful in the air. The fear of what lay beyond the trees had grown too strong to ignore. The camp had become unnervingly still as night fell. The usual chirping of crickets, the soft rustle of wind through the trees, those comforting sounds of nature, were gone. In their place was a heavy silence, a kind of thick quiet that pressed down on everything, suffocating the air. It was as if the world itself had stopped, waiting for something. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something I wasn't prepared for. I stepped out into the campgrounds once more, the dim moonlight casting long, jagged shadows over the cabins. The place was empty, except for the kids who were tucked inside their cabins. Their doors were tightly shut, the windows covered by thick curtains. The campfire from earlier had burned down to little more than a few embers, barely flickering in the cool night air. I didn't know what I was searching for, but I had to keep moving. The woods were calling me. It was almost as though the trees themselves were pulling me deeper into their grasp, urging me toward that spot on the map. The one I had seen earlier in the library, the place marked with strange symbols. The symbols had felt like warnings, but there was no turning back now. I had to know what was going on, why Ben had vanished, why the camp felt like it was slowly suffocating under some unseen weight. I walked toward the edge of the camp, where the darkness of the forest seemed to swallow the path. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their twisted branches casting long fingers that stretched out toward me. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, the tension in the air making it hard to breathe. The path, once clear, was now obscured by creeping vines and underbrush, as if the woods were trying to keep me out. I pushed forward, forcing myself to stay focused, to ignore the growing sense of unease that gnawed at me. But with each step, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't just the sensation of eyes on my back, it was deeper, like the forest itself had eyes, like the very land was alive and aware of my intrusion. The moonlight barely pierced through the canopy above, and the trees seemed to form a web, blocking out the stars. The air was cold, but there was no breeze, only the weight of silence. I reached the clearing marked on the map, the place I'd been drawn to by some force I couldn't explain. It was just as the map had shown, a clearing in the woods with ancient stones arranged in a circle. The stones were old, weathered by time, but their arrangement was deliberate, as if they were meant to be there. I stepped closer, my flashlight flickering in my trembling hands. The symbols I had seen on the map were etched into the stones, but they were far more intricate than I had imagined. I couldn't help but reach out and trace one of the symbols with my fingers. The moment I touched it, the ground beneath me shuddered. The air grew colder still, and a deep groan echoed from somewhere beneath the earth, as if the very ground was waking up. My heart raced as I backed away, trying to make sense of what was happening. The symbols were not just markings. They were part of something ancient, something powerful. Before I could react, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I whipped around, but the clearing was empty. The wind had picked up and the trees were swaying, but there was no one there. Yet, the sound of footsteps continued, getting louder, as if someone or something was walking through the woods toward me. I spun in circles, my flashlight darting across the trees, but again, there was nothing. Then I heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come." My blood ran cold. I couldn't breathe. The voice came from everywhere, from within the trees, from the earth beneath me, as if the very land was speaking to me. My eyes darted to the edge of the clearing, but I saw no movement, no figure emerging from the shadows. But the whispering continued, growing louder, more urgent, as if something was trying to get through to me. "Leave now. They are waiting. They're always waiting." I stumbled backward, my mind spinning. I had to leave. I had to get back to the camp, back to the kids, back to safety. But the trees were closing in around me. The path I had walked to get here was now obscured, as if the forest itself had decided to hide it. My heart raced in my chest as I tried to find my bearings, but the woods had become a maze, the trees pressing closer with every step. A figure appeared in the distance, a shadow against the dark backdrop of the forest. It wasn't clear at first, but as I focused, I saw it. Ben. But something was wrong. His eyes were wide, his face expressionless, and he was walking toward me in a trance-like state, his steps slow and deliberate. "Ben," I called, my voice shaking. "Ben, what are you doing out here? Where have you been?" But Ben didn't answer. He just continued walking toward me, his face vacant, as though he didn't recognize me. The whispering in my ears grew louder, more insistent, as if the forest was trying to warn me. "He's not Ben anymore." I took a step back, panic surging through my veins. The figure continued to approach, but I could feel something shift in the air. The trees around me seemed to whisper, their branches reaching down, as if trying to claim me. The air became suffocating, and I turned and ran. I didn't look back. The sound of my feet pounding the earth mixed with the growing sound of footsteps behind me, always just out of reach. But I knew, whatever had taken Ben, whatever was in these woods, was coming for me. My heart was pounding as I ran through the woods, branches scratching at my arms, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound of footsteps behind me was unmistakable, growing louder, but when I glanced back, there was no one there. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating, as though the forest itself had become an enemy, an entity that didn't want me to leave. I had no idea how far I had run or where I was anymore. Everything was a blur of trees, shadows, and a rising sense of panic. The moonlight was fading, and the woods had grown darker. I could no longer tell where the camp was, the familiar trail markers lost in the ever-encroaching darkness. The oppressive silence had returned, and I could feel something in the air shift, a quiet waiting, like the trees themselves were listening, as though they were aware of my every move. I stumbled through the woods, trying to find my bearings, but everything around me felt distorted, wrong. The path that had once been clear was now twisted and obstructed, branches twisting at odd angles, roots cropping up unexpectedly, threatening to trip me. I felt like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare, with no clear way out. The earth beneath my feet felt unstable, like it was shifting under me. Then I heard it. a sound that made my blood run cold. The whispering was back, not in the distance this time, but right next to me, in my ear. I froze, my heart stopping in my chest. The voice was soft but unmistakable. "It's too late now. You're part of the forest." The words cut through the air, and for a moment I couldn't move. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. The forest was alive, and it had claimed me. I wasn't just running from whatever had taken Ben. I was being pulled into something darker, something ancient that had been waiting for years. I snapped out of my stupor, forced myself to move again, but the path I had been following was now blocked by an imposing figure. I barely registered the shape before me. Ben. But this was no longer the boy I had known. His face was hollow, his eyes dark and vacant, as though his soul had been sucked out, leaving nothing behind. His mouth was open, but no sound came out, just an endless whisper of unintelligible words. I took a step back, my mind spinning, but I was trapped. The woods had closed in around me, and Ben's figure loomed before me, his expression still vacant, his presence unnatural. The whispering grew louder, and for a moment I thought I could feel the ground shake, as if something deep within the forest was awakening. "He's gone. They all are. You should have stayed away." The voice, Ben's voice, but not really, came from all around me, and I could feel the weight of it pressing in. I could feel the forest around me, feel it in my bones, like the trees were leaning in to hear, to watch. The branches above me seemed to stretch, as if they were reaching for me, their shadows growing longer, more sinister. And in that moment, I understood. The forest wasn't just a place, it was a living thing, an entity that had been here long before the camp was built. It was feeding on the souls of those who dared to come here, those who strayed too close to the ancient darkness at its core. The ritual, the ancient symbols on the map, the disappearances, the way the campers had acted, the whispers in the trees, it was all part of it. The camp had been built on sacred ground that the forest had claimed long ago. And once you entered, you didn't leave. You became part of the forest, a sacrifice to the spirits that haunted it. I turned, trying to run, but the trees seemed to close in, their trunks narrowing the path until I couldn't move. My chest tightened, my breaths shallow as panic overwhelmed me. The whispering was deafening now, voices layered over one another, each one more insistent than the last. "You can't escape. You belong here now." And then I saw it, a flash of light, distant but growing closer. It wasn't the moonlight, and it wasn't a flashlight. It was something other, something strange. The glow seemed to pull at the edges of the forest, illuminating a small clearing ahead. Without thinking, I pushed forward, stumbling over roots, desperate to reach the light. As I entered the clearing, I found the source, the altar. It was an ancient stone structure, covered in moss and overgrown vines. Symbols, just like the ones on the map, were etched into the stones. This was where it had all started. The ritual, the disappearances, the ancient cult that had once called this place home, performing their ceremonies to appease the spirits of the forest, binding their victims to the land forever. I fell to my knees, gasping for air. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. The disappearances were no accident. They were sacrifices. The campers, Ben, everyone who had vanished, they were part of the forest now, part of its eternal hunger. And if I didn't find a way to break the curse, I would be next. I would become another lost soul, trapped in the woods for all eternity. With a surge of desperation, I scrambled for the ancient book I had found earlier in the library. the diary. I flipped through its pages, desperately searching for anything that could break the ritual, anything that could free the souls trapped here. The words were frantic, a plea for help from someone who had tried and failed to escape. And then I found it, the final incantation. But there was a catch. It required a sacrifice, a life given willingly to break the cycle. And I knew then that I had no choice. If I wanted to free Ben, the other campers, and myself, I would have to make the ultimate sacrifice. But what price would the forest demand from me? The weight of the decision pressed down on me, each word in the incantation weighing heavier than the last. The page was yellowed and fragile, the handwriting frantic and jagged, as if the person who had written it had known they were running out of time, running out of hope. I could feel the forest around me, its trees leaning in, its dark presence pressing against my back like an invisible force. It was as if the forest itself had heard me, understood the decision I was about to make. The whispering voices in the wind had died down, but the silence that followed was just as oppressive. The ritual was clear, a sacrifice, a willing offering to break the curse that had bound the souls of the lost children, the souls of those who had disappeared. I had to make the choice, and it was either I gave up my own life to set them free, or I would join them in this forest, trapped in the endless loop of terror and despair. There was no escape, not unless I made the ultimate sacrifice. I had always believed that heroes were the ones who made the selfless choice, who did what was right, no matter the cost. But this was something entirely different. The idea of laying down my life for others felt like a distant thought, a noble gesture reserved for someone braver, stronger, someone with more courage than I had. And yet, the forest whispered, calm, patient. It had no need for my bravery. It needed my sacrifice. The ritual would take what it wanted, whether I agreed or not. The forest was ancient and had been waiting far too long for someone like me to wander into its trap. Ben, the other campers, they were already gone, part of the forest's hunger. If I didn't act, if I didn't break the cycle, they would remain trapped here forever, just like the others before them. I stood there, staring at the altar, the symbols glowing faintly under the moonlight. It was unnerving, the way the light seemed to pulse with an energy all its own. I could feel it tugging at my very soul, calling me to make the decision. I wasn't sure how much time I had. The whispers were rising again, louder now, swirling around me like wind, carrying with them dark promises. I glanced over at Ben, still standing there in the clearing, his hollow eyes locked onto mine. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. I knew what he was. He was no longer the child I had met at the camp, the boy full of life and curiosity. He had been claimed. His body was here, but his soul had been taken by the forest, bound to this place until someone made the sacrifice that would free him. It was a trap, a loop that had claimed more than just Ben. But now, as I stood there, the decision was clear. The whispers had grown louder, demanding my compliance. The forest needed me to surrender, to break its hold on those trapped inside. There was no escaping without paying the price. Taking a deep breath, I stepped toward the altar. The stones seemed to hum under my feet, vibrating with energy. The ritual was nearing its final moment. The last words of the incantation swirling around me like a song I didn't know how to sing. I could feel the weight of the decision as my hand hovered over the symbols, ready to press my palm against them, ready to offer myself to break the curse. But as I placed my hand on the stone, the world seemed to shift. The ground trembled and the air around me grew cold, like I had opened a gate, an ancient door that led to somewhere beyond comprehension. The trees groaned, their limbs stretching toward me, their shadows growing darker, deeper, as if they were reaching for my very soul. "No!" The voice echoed in my mind, a scream I couldn't ignore. It wasn't mine, it was Ben's. He stepped forward, his eyes now wide, his features twisted in pain. "You don't have to do this." His voice was soft, broken. He wasn't himself anymore, I realized. The forest had already taken him, just like the others. He wasn't a boy anymore. He was a victim, a part of this ancient curse that had claimed the lives of so many before him. I knew then that I couldn't let him remain like this. I had to save him. I had to save all of them. With the last ounce of my strength, I pulled away from the altar, the stone beneath my hand cold and unforgiving. The forest let out an angry growl, as if it had been denied, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to give in to whatever darkness it demanded of me. I wasn't going to sacrifice my soul, not for any curse, not for the power the forest thought it could hold over me. Instead, I began chanting the words I had read in the diary. Words I wasn't sure would work, but knew had to be tried. The forest seemed to recoil at the sound of the ancient language, its branches curling in on themselves, the trees shaking as though the very ground was rejecting its hold over me. Ben's form flickered, his eyes blinking, his face morphing as though he was struggling to escape. And then, finally, he collapsed to the ground, gasping for air like someone who had just emerged from a deep, suffocating sleep. I ran to him, my heart pounding. The forest screamed in fury, but the ritual was broken. The curse that had kept us all trapped had been lifted, and the grip of the woods loosened, the darkness dissipating around us. The camp would never be the same, but as I helped Ben to his feet, I knew we had done it. We had escaped. The forest's whispers had died down, and the air was no longer thick with terror, but I could feel its lingering presence, as though it was waiting for the next wanderer, the next soul to be drawn into its grasp. The camp would be abandoned now, left to the past, but the memories would stay with us, the ones who had survived, who had made it out of the woods alive. I had seen the truth, and now I understood that some stories were better left untold, some places better left untouched.